Thank you, Pastor Lori. It's great to be with you all today. And what a great teaching yesterday. I really love that. Actually, Pastor Lori, you set us up kind of like an episode of Netflix. We kind of walked through it and you said, look at the scene. And then we all stepped back and then something dramatic happens and we got to the end and we ended in suspense. We had no idea what was going to happen. So let's just do a quick summary. That's how we do it. Like these episodes come out, right? Paul almost dies at the hands of the Jews. The Roman tribune pulls him from the crowds. He's about ready to be flogged. The Roman centurion, then recognizing he's a Roman, he stops the process and he orders a meeting the next day. And here we are. We are ready for the next day meeting in chapter 23, when Paul's actually going to sit down with all of the Jewish leaders, the council and the priests. And here we go into chapter 23. This is where we are. Let's start together. Chapter 23, verse 1. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him in the mouth. And Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me be struck? Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of the Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, no angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor, and some of the scribes and the Pharisees parties stood up and contended sharply. We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him back to the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. So before I go further, I love this first little section. It's just packed with all sorts of historical nuggets, but it's also packed with some really, I think, insightful pieces. And I just want to, Pastor Jason said this on Sunday, and I think it's really important for us to remember, this is a historical picture of something Paul's going through. So we have to be really careful not to say, hey, this applies to me. But I do think that there's some themes and there's some concepts in here that we could look at and we can learn from. But it is really a historical picture of this part of Paul's life. So let's go back and look at verse 1. And I love this. Paul said, brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience to this day. This is a massive statement. And Paul typically is a bold sort of guy, but he just says it with a certain amount of fervor. I can actually picture him just kind of saying this, brothers. And he also says it, he just uses the word brothers. He doesn't use the words brothers and fathers, which often you would do in the context when you're dealing with, or when you're speaking to elders. So he's kind of talking to everybody as a peer-to-peer here. But he makes this bold statement and he says, until this day. And one of the things that I wondered about, does this mean that until this day, since I converted to Christianity? And I think one of the things that as I was researching this, I learned and I thought about, and I think that this applies to us, is that Paul was like an all-in sort of guy following God, even when he was off course. Even when he was off course and he was killing Christians, he actually thought that he was following God in a good conscience at that moment in time, until the Lord removed the scales from his eyes. And I thought that there was something really beautiful about that in this idea that we can live wholly for God, but we might sometimes be off course in that, and we'll learn in the process. He'll redirect us back. But this idea of living wholeheartedly, I thought was something that was really interesting at the beginning of this passage. this bold statement actually didn't go over very well. The Jewish leaders didn't see any of this conscientious living in Paul. In fact, they were seeing somebody who was creating all sorts of problems for him. And the high priest Ananias commanded those beside him to give him a smack in the mouth. And I don't know if maybe we'll show a show of hands here. How many of you guys heard the word Ananias and you said, hey, I thought I've already heard Ananias' name a few times in Acts, right? This is not one, but two. This is a third Ananias. This is not any of the other Ananiases. The Ananias in Acts 3 was the Jewish high priest who lived from about AD, or actually who reigned from AD 47 to 66. And he was assassinated. In the end, he was actually assassinated by the Jews because he supported the Romans. And he was a very selfish leader. He was a ruthless leader. He was known for kind of his cruelty and his greed. And so he wasn't a man who was really interested in the word of God or in teaching the way others might have been in that space. But he was a man who was really after his own self-interest. So Paul, I think, kind of had this in his heart when he stood in front of him. Paul kind of strikes back at him with some strong language. God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And like, it's what's really cool here is that Paul brings clarity, like Paul often does, but he brings it with a little bit of a, you know, how Paul can kind of sometimes get under your skin. Oftentimes when Lois and I are reading the Bible together, we'll say, Paul sometimes just gets under my skin because like he's so in your face with his language. And he kind of comes back at this high priest and he responds in a tough way. But unfortunately, because he responded with like so much force back, he brought clarity to the fact that the priest was breaking the law. But because of his response, he actually breaks the Jewish law as well. And this is one of the things this is one of the areas that it caused me just to think for a little bit about how many times we make clear and truthful statements, but because our posture's wrong, the message gets lost. Like if you notice what happens right after Paul speaks, the other Jewish leaders immediately focus on Paul's kind of energetic response towards the priest, and they totally miss the point. And it kind of caused me to think, how many times in my life do I respond with good or accurate information or helpful information, but my approach, like my words, my body language, negates the value of my message. And in fact, last night while I was working on this, and I think my wife Lois is on the call here, so she's probably got her thumbs up saying, I can't believe you're going to share this. But last night, as I was preparing for this, she asked me a question and I answered her. But because my head was in this space of working on this, I didn't respond in a super just warm, outgoing sort of way. And she's like, what are you feeling? I'm like, I'm not feeling anything at all. But my focus was in such a different space that she actually got something different from me than I intended in the first place. So I think that this is an area that we should all like spend a little bit of time and pause on, because as followers of Jesus, we actually want to have the ability to communicate. Our words and our heart posture needs to be clear and right before the Lord. So let's just jump back into verse 12. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by oath to taste no food until we've killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. I don't know if any of you caught this, but Paul had a sister. He had family around him. And it was kind of cool for me to just think about that. This is not like a big, profound statement, but it was kind of cool to think about Paul as a son, as a brother, it helped me kind of consider his humanity a little bit, because oftentimes I picture Paul as a bit of a one-dimensional, passionate evangelist. And this little moment, I thought, oh, Paul as the family man, the person who was a part of a family. There were people around him during this time that were supporting him, encouraging him. They were actually showing up in jail and giving him food and encouraging him. So I thought that was kind of neat. This is that Paul's sister is brought into the story here. All right, back on track, sidetrack. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and, going alongside him, asked privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, and it's though they're going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat or drink until they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one you have informed me of these things." Then he called two of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen, and go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride, and to give him and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect: "Claudius Lysisus, to his excellence Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by him when I came upon him, and the soldiers rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council, and I found that he was being accused about questions of the law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul up by night to Antipatris, and the next day they returned to the barracks, letting his horsemen go with him. And when they had come to Caesarea, they delivered a letter to the governor and presented Paul to him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, and he learned that he was from Sicilia. And he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And then he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So this little piece right here is a place in time where Paul has been put under scrutiny, but he's been able to leverage his Roman citizenship, which not a lot of Jews had. But Paul had his Roman citizenship. And so he was able to use his Roman citizenship to bring them into proximity of those people who had power, and those people that had the ability to help him persuade others that he was innocent in this case. I think what's interesting when I read through this and I think about Paul's life, he was a very driven person, but he was always also a very thoughtful person, and he was a very well learned person. And when I consider the things that God is calling us to do in our day and age, I think he's calling us. We live in a very complex world. I even thinking about what's happening in Israel these days, and the complexity of those relationships that exist there today. These relationships actually existed back in this era, in 66 AD. And recognizing that we as followers of Jesus and leaders in our world, we have to be creative. We have to use everything that God's giving us to bring about peace and to share the good news of Jesus. And I love how Paul just looks at whatever angle he has and he follows that, even though sometimes it means he's in jail. So again, we end this chapter with Paul in Caesarea, and he's waiting for Ananias to come and to present on these charges. And we're going to start where we started the chapter with him in jail. We're going to start chapter 24 with him in jail again. And Ananias is going to come down. So let's just keep reading. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and spokesmen his name was Tertullus. And so these spokesmen would have been people that they would have been Romans, and they would have understood the Roman law. And so oftentimes the Jews would bring them in to help them to communicate to the Romans their position so that they would be heard well. They're often called orators. And so when you hear him speak, you'll just know that this is kind of what he did. This is how he talks. Since we enjoy much peace, and since your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made in this nation. In every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg in your kindness to hear us briefly, for we have found this man to be a plague, one who stirs up riots among the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. But by examining him yourself, you'll be able to find out from him everything of which we accuse him. And so he comes in and he just kind of says, here's Paul. He's not a good man. And we have some people that will just kind of, blaspheme and just kind of tell him, we're just going to share with him that he's not there's no facts here. We're just going to share with him that he's not a great guy. The Jews joined in on him, and then the governor looked at him, he nodded, I heard what you said, and he moved on to Paul. And we should know that Felix is not a great man either. In fact, his rule over this region was not great. He was very harsh, very cruel, killed many, many people if they didn't see things his way. And so as he moves to Paul, Paul is stepping in, and he knows he is at the mercy of one man, and he speaks with incredible clarity here. And I love this. Let's just listen to how he speaks. Knowing that for many years you've been a judge of this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. So he doesn't kind of butter him up at all. He just says, I know that you are the person who's going to make the call on this, but I cheerfully am going to make my defense. You can verify that it's not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anybody or stirring up any crowd, either in the temple or the synagogues or the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring against me. But I confess to you that according to the way which they call the sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and is written by the prophets, having hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. Pastor Laurie, yesterday you encouraged all of us to think about like our 2-minute testimony. And here's another place where Paul just steps in and he very clearly and concisely says, this is who I am, and you will find me innocent because of this. And he says, so I've taken pains to have a clear conscience between both God and man. Now, after several years, I've come to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. And while doing this, they found me purified in the temple, without any crowd or tumult. But some of the Jews from Asia, they ought to be here to make the accusation, should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before council. Other than this one thing that I cried out when I was standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. So let's wrap up this chapter. Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, with Lysisus, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Now, I thought this was really interesting, that he had an accurate knowledge of the way. So even in these early days, leaders in the Roman Empire are hearing about Christianity. They're understanding that there is a new movement that's happening in the world at this point in time. And this guy, Felix, not a nice man, actually knew about it. His wife happened to be a Jew. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. So he's going to hold on to him, wait for somebody else to come down from the Jewish leaders, and then also wait for his the Roman who saved his life to come down and kind of share some things. But interestingly enough, Lysias never comes down, and Paul spends some time with Felix and his wife Drusilla. So after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who is Jewish, and he sent Paul and heard him speak about Jesus Christ. As he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away from the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. And so Paul starts in prison, he ends in prison, and tomorrow we're going to get to find out whether he gets out of prison. If I look at this last little piece here, there was a moment when I was reading through and I thought, oh, like, listen to Felix. He said, "Hey, I'm going to bring Paul. We're going to talk about faith in Jesus." And then he goes, "When I get the opportunity, I will summon you." And it was always this sense of, oh, I'm interested in what you have to say, but I'm not interested in applying it to my life. I'm interested in bringing you before me because I'm hoping that you'll give me some money, that you'll help me in my own personal endeavors here as this governor. But there was never a spot where the good news of Jesus actually touched his heart. And I think for us, as we read this passage, it's a very good reminder for us in the Western world. It's very easy for us to look at what it is that faith has for us, and we pick and choose whether we want to actually bring it into our lives. We actually will say, is this something that applies to my life, or is this something that would be convenient for me to apply to my life? And if it is, we will often bring it in. But if it's not convenient, if it's difficult, if it causes us to go into some dark valleys, we actually don't want to do it, even though it's what God's calling us to do. And so I think that even as Felix in this final section is considering what it is that the Christian faith has to offer him, he's only looking at it through the world's eyes. If it only helps me get further along in this world, then in a worldly way, then I might take it on. If not, I think it's okay. And so Felix ends up not doing anything about his faith, even though he has Paul sitting right beside him in prison. So we leave Paul for another day in prison, and there's a couple of things that really stood out for me here that I'd love for us to spend a bit of time exploring together. I was really challenged by Paul's statement at the beginning of chapter 23. Have I lived my life in a good conscience before God? And my first discussion question, and this applies to, I think, all of us, is like, can I actually make this statement about my life today? Can I say I've lived my life in good conscience before God? And I would ask why or why not? Like, what would I need to change? What would need to change in my life so that I could actually say that with the same level of conviction that Paul did? The second question that I have kind of comes out of Paul's response to Ananias. And my second question is, like, what relationships do we have where we desire to communicate with a better heart posture, like where the fruit of the Spirit is more evident? And oftentimes, as I was reflecting on this question, I think about my wife, our kids, our parents, maybe coworkers and bosses. And those are the places, those relationships that are closest to us. I think oftentimes we step into a conversation or we step into day to day with sometimes the wrong posture in our hearts. And then it just as a follow-up, like, what causes us to have that wrong posture? You know, as I was sharing earlier, like, my posture with Lois was because I was distracted and I had a certain mindset. I had a plan A that I was going on. She was asking me about a plan B, and well, there's no reason for me to kind of get myself in a little bit of a knot about that. But what are the things that cause us? Is it maybe previous hurt? Is it guilt or fear or impatience? Recurring conversations that we have that we're not kind of getting anywhere. So we kind of have a built up reactionary, even physical response to that. And what steps do we need to change on that?
One to the two and two to the three. Let the world see the Holy Trinity.
Up early in the morning, heart-strong family, faithfully talking with the Almighty. He walks with me through storms and tears, my doubts and